Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and we have a lot going on in the legislation right now. One of those is a really big bill. That's Senate Bill 181. This has to do with oil and gas. So I have one of my favorite people joining me by phone. I have Chris Brown, who's the Director of Policy and Research with Common Sense Policy Roundtable. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for letting me back on.
Yes, absolutely. It is spring break time, so I know you're out of town, so we appreciate your time that you're taking out for us and joining us by phone. But let's give the audience just a little bit of a refresher of who you are and how you ended up at CSPR.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, as you said, I'm the Director of Policy and Research with the Common Sense Policy Roundtable. We are a free enterprise think tank that focuses on economic and policy issues that matter for the long-term prosperity of Colorado citizens. We formed a partnership several years ago with several other business organizations throughout Colorado, and that group is called the REMI Partnership. And so we prioritize and launch all of our research, most of our research, under the REMI Partnership, and that group includes the Colorado Bankers Association, Colorado Association of Realtors, Denver South Economic Development Partnership, and Colorado Concern. And so collectively, as an organization, as a group of individual organizations that have an interest in the long-term health and well-being, coming at issues from sort of different perspectives, we try to educate, inform Coloradans, elected officials, business leaders on the economic implications of policy matters policy issues that matter most to Coloradans.
Wonderful to hear, and you guys do a great job. And so the majority of what you do are handing out studies that you do. One of the last reasons I had you on was to talk about Proposition 112, which you guys did a great job on that study, and I think you got the word out to a lot of Coloradans when dealing with that and showing them why that was such a bad idea for the economy here in Colorado. So we want to do that again. I know that you guys did a study for Senate Bill 181, and we'll get to the details of that study momentarily. But first, I kind of want to define here what Senate Bill 181 is. One of the main things that this bill is set out to do is to redefine COGCC, that's the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, to redefine their mission, to make safety and public health the -- 1 concern when it comes to their mission. The other two things that we're seeing on this bill are land use rights are falling back to but falling to local governments. And then there's also some forced pooling regulations that we're looking at here. So if you don't mind going through that with me and what exactly those mean and entail.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. If you want me to walk through each one, or I'd be happy to sort of elaborate on how I understand, and as we've tracked this, what each of those components mean.
Perfect. Yeah.
So I think you brought up the mission, the change in COGC's mission, and I think this is a broader question that I had as soon as I got into this research on this particular bill was the stated effort and goal of this legislation is, as you said, to prioritize health and safety when issuing permits, when regulating oil and natural gas development. And so it's a little unclear exactly what that will entail. They've taken some specific measures in the bill that we feel are pretty significant in terms of that actually translate to the economic impact, specifically when promulgating future rules and evaluating permits. They've removed the language that requires an analysis of economic feasibility or technical feasibility. So when any rule, any regulation is being developed, whether it's at the US EPA or across any regulatory agency in Colorado, there's generally always an analysis that weighs benefits and costs, and how those benefits and costs gets weighted ultimately sort of impacts the outcome and the extent to which a new regulation, which say limits greenhouse gas emission or would improve a safety technique, that cost-benefit analysis ultimately weighs in that decision. And by removing the language in this particular bill that again removes the economic and technical feasibility, it's really open-ended, and it would undoubtedly tip the scale towards regulation that promotes health and safety that then doesn't consider the feasibility. And so we're not questioning whether industry activity should be healthy and safe. I think it's a question to what degree, and to what degree does that leave it open-ended to make policies which really just are not feasible. And so the one of the early questions I had was trying to figure out if this is about the issuance of permits and certain permits for new oil and gas drilling, which would violate certain tenets. My question is which permits historically have violated these new priorities, and it's really unclear what permits have in fact violated those tenets. So as you pointed out, yes, it's changed the mission from just regulating to promoting health and safety, and excuse me, I take that back. It's changed the mission from facilitating oil and gas permitting to regulating, and it's uncertain to what degree that will impact permitting, but it leaves the interpretation of some of the language very, very open-ended.
Which is frustrating, I think, for a lot of people, because, of course, when you're looking at this and you're like, oh, how wasn't public health and safety the number one concern and to begin with? And it's not as though COGCC was ignoring health and safety along the way, but it is taking out that verbiage of looking and making sure that the cost benefits are feasible for these drilling,
right.
For drilling, yeah.
Yeah, and there's other agencies that have regulated health and the environment, and we've reviewed some of their research as it relates to water quality, air quality, and so taking all of that into consideration has really been has been the effort of the regulatory agencies, and so it's a question, how does this specifically change? But it clearly leaves interpretation. A lot for interpretation.
Yes, which I seems to be a recurring theme in legislation this go around. Let's talk about having these land use rights fall to local governments. Essentially, what's going to happen is if a company wants to drill somewhere, it has to go to the local government within their county.
That's
city.
right. That's right. So my understanding is it gives land use authority to local governments to regulate oil and gas in a similar way that it has land use restriction, land use authority over other industrial, commercial, residential activity. And I think it's interesting in that, I guess from my standpoint, it doesn't matter where the regulation is coming from in terms of protecting health, safety, promoting oil and gas development. It doesn't matter whether it's local or at a state level. I think there's some concerns about the ability to have expertise at a local level, more distributed outside of a central state entity. But I think what's important to note as part of this debate, and the reason why that authority for establishing setbacks and establishing that land use rights at the state level, was to protect private property rights. So the challenge with oil and gas drilling, and why it's different from other industrial activity, is it needs to take place in a close proximity to where those resources are. So unlike auto manufacturing, where you can put essentially anywhere as long as you have the logistics, the transportation infrastructure, it doesn't need to be right next to the steel mill, let's say. Whereas oil and gas has to be, because you have to actually drill and extract, you have to be in proximity. And so there's that ultimately you can't just restrict surface access endlessly and still retain access to those minerals and subsurface property rights. So that's the overlapping challenge. And so with this land use authority that local government is seeking, or some are seeking, or is seeking to be given through this legislation, it's an open-ended question to what extent they'd be able to use that to restrict access to private property rights. They would undoubtedly open themselves up to a lot of potential lawsuits and further litigation, but that is ultimately the challenge. Is it's a balance between private property rights and industry efforts to extract those minerals and resources.
Interesting. That's a great perspective that you've got there on that. Let's talk about forced pooling and what that looks like.
Yes, I'm less familiar with that particular piece, but current law allows, because of the way the resource exists underneath the surface it's not like a home above the surface where an individual, it's very clear that you own that structure, that those bricks are yours. It's because they're all underneath the surface in a pool of natural gas or resource, or then the property rights, when someone wants to go and exercise their rights, they inevitably potentially are extracting from someone else's resource pool as well that also has rights to that. And so to protect owners, there's rules to protect owners that have not chosen or not yet chosen to access their minerals or access their rights. They are protected in that they will still get compensated. If one person chooses to go after their resource, it's part of a larger subsurface pool, then other owners will be compensated. And this legislation increases the threshold. So instead of, I think I apologize, I don't know the exact law, but currently, or what it is currently, but it would increase that threshold to require a majority of those pool owners to want to extract their resource rather than where it currently stands, which is less than that. And so it would make it more challenging for fewer individuals. And it's unclear whether it's a majority of the pool or a majority of owners. So it's not quite clear to me, but it impacts that particular aspect of drilling and the forced pooling component.
Interesting. I like that you keep saying it's not quite clear to you. What you do for a living, quite literally, is look at things and interpret them. And if you're having trouble with understanding this clearly, obviously a lot of voters are going to have trouble with understanding this. So that that being said, I want to talk about the study that you guys did, and clearly the motivation behind that, I would imagine, is similar to why you did one behind Proposition 112, to show voters the actual economic impacts for all Coloradans.
Yeah, and it's interesting you picked up on something that I've been saying as well, that the theme of some of our research has been highlighting uncertainty in what is being discussed from a policy standpoint. And I think that ultimately is the large concern. And it's not just the uncertainty, but it's the range of authority that, in this particular case, that is authorized at the local government level, that could, as the initial fiscal note pointed out, it could lead to sort of an outright prohibition of oil and gas development. So the range of impacts that this authorizes are expansive. And so people have talked about guardrails or ways in which we could shore up what that uncertainty actually is. And I think so this regulation authorizes new rules and new authorities, so it's not actually imposing any of these moratoriums as have been discussed, but it's pretty clear that what would be more likely, or what would be more possible under these changes. And so that's really been, again, as you point out, the focus. And I think any industry can appreciate the need to have certainty in their business, especially one that makes very large investments, long-term investments. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on in identifying that it is very uncertain what the implications and impacts might be.
And I think the bill was written specifically that way for that reason. I think we were all a little bit shocked when Governor Polis actually didn't vote for 112, because he had proposed the 2,500-foot setback before. And so I think we were all a little shocked, and not that Governor Polis has his name on this bill at all. But I think this was specifically written to maybe start working on shutting down oil and gas production in Colorado.
Well, I think your previous question, I think we wanted to highlight, this organization has studied issues related to setbacks previously, again, along with a range of other economic policies that we've discussed on your show. But we recognize the significant impact that oil and gas development has across the state to not only the businesses and companies that are directly in that business of oil and gas extraction, but all the associated industries and downstream companies. I guess they're technically that midstream and related through intermediate demand and so the supply chain. So we wanted to highlight again, given some of the questions, we listened to some of the testimony, we listened to some of the committee comments in some of the Senate committees where different legislators were asking these questions. We don't, to the extent we don't understand the range of potential impacts or the bounds of the potential impacts, and we thought we had a good opportunity to shed some light, given our work on Proposition 112, given our understanding of how to model or create the scenarios that would look at what a slowdown or shutdown in part of the industry or the entire industry, and help people understand how slowing and reducing the amount of annual growth or new production, to what extent that has a long-term impact. As you slow down drilling in the first year, you lose the future years of production, even as those wells decline in their production, as they get less and less productive over time. That cumulative effect of losing, as we highlighted in our study, a third of new production, half of new production, it has a significant impact over time in reducing the overall size of the industry. And so, yeah, going back to the point, it's really uncertain to what extent to the exact impacts we would see, because it's contingent upon exactly how local governments take up their new authority. It's contingent upon what happens during the rulemaking process. So it takes a long time to actually create the rules that SB 181 authorizes, and during that time, there's language that gives discretion to the director of the COGCC to flag and require additional analysis and even pull permits with limited criteria. And so it's an open-ended question, not only what happens once we see all of the local governments and what rules they will end up imposing, what rules the state will end up imposing that would, given the change in the definition of the COGCC, but also what happens during that rulemaking process. So not to leave another open-ended question in your listeners' minds, but it's really the theme of what triggered us and what really got us to think about how to add some numbers to this debate in terms of what those potential economic and fiscal impacts were.
Yeah, definitely. I'm with you on this theme of confusion and leaving us in the dust here. Local governments are going to have to review cases that they've never seen before with this new allowance into ruling on that. The new director of COGCC could ultimately have more power than we've seen in the past. So there's a lot that goes into this. Regardless of all the questions and the uncertainty that we have about it, the numbers don't lie. Economic impact is going to happen if this passes, regardless.
Yeah, well, and again, if I think it's a question of some of the questions I've gotten are related to, and I guess maybe some direct questions, but also comments I've heard in testimony, is the extent to which, well, if industries can't operate in a healthy and safe fashion, why should they be able to operate? And I think it's less of a question of, as the initial point, that it's uncertain, it's unclear which permits have been historically that violate these new tenants. So we don't even know what percent or what share or what number have historically been in question or been a problem. So going forward, it's very unclear, but all of these complications that translate to longer periods of time. So to your point, it's what we don't know the exact amount and the exact impact that this will have. What we do know is that all of this uncertainty and the additional rules and complexity in permitting and siting adds time. And as we've heard from different organizations that have, again, provided testimony, have talked to the extent to which uncertainty and delays in timing and potential moratoriums or shutdowns or slowdowns or those all have impacts. And we study a lot of these questions through the lens of using an economic model. So we use a model built by a firm called REMI. It's an economic simulation model. Any organization can go out and obtain a license and recreate the simulations that we put together as well to estimate the impacts across jobs, GDP, and tax revenue. We found that if a third of new oil and gas production was lost annually over the next 11 years, then by 2030, you'd have about 61,000 fewer jobs across all sectors. You'd forego about $4.4 billion in local state and local tax revenue, again, cumulatively over that 11-year window. And for context, we found that about roughly two-thirds of all of those jobs that are impacted are outside of the oil and gas industry specifically. So that's a lot of associated jobs in construction, real estate, other professional services. And so the impacts, again, are quite large, and we wanted to speak directly to some of the debate around the fiscal implications and some of the questions that have been raised in terms of how this would impact school funding, how this would impact local governments, and wanted to, again, provide some benchmarks for that dialogue so that could understand, again, how changes to this industry impact the economy more broadly.
Yes. Well, we really appreciate all of the research that you've done and joining me to share that research with our audience. Chris, it has been a pleasure having you on. And again, we are going to vote May 7th. We may see some amendments in the meantime to the SB 181, so keep a lookout for that. You can find the study as well as CSPR's website in the description below. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. Find this podcast and more at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Thank you so much, Chris, for all of this wonderful information.
Great. Thank you, Alex.